Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Afrocentric History with your host, Caro. Since I'm launching this podcast in October, I couldn't think of a better topic than one involving another entity that also began its journey in October, Nigeria. Today, my good friends, we're diving into the rise and fall of the first Nigerian Republic. How did the largest and most promising black nation in the world descend into chaos just 6 years after independence? How did the military come to dominate Nigerian politics for over 2 decades? Why did it happen? Who's to blame? And why did the people cheer its collapse? And I think, most importantly, can it happen again? This is a story of colonialism, ethnic politics, and a failed first experiment with democracy. For all this and more, stay tuned. In this first episode, we'll discuss the events that led to Nigeria's independence from British rule. We'll start our story on the 31st of March 1953, the day Chief Anthony Enahoro raised his now famous motion that this House accepts as a primary political objective the attainment of self-government for Nigeria in 1956. I read an excerpt of the speech he gave. Sir, this motion is an invitation to the honorable members of this House to associate the highest legislature of our land with the express desire of the peoples of this country, whose views we all represent, for political autonomy in 1956. It seeks to provide representatives from all parts of the country with an opportunity to exchange views on the most burning questions of our time. It is an invitation to this House to make a declaration of objective with regard to Nigeria's freedom. Chief Obafemi Awolowo, the leader of Inaro's party, later described this as, and I quote, the most prominent landmark in Nigeria's struggle for freedom. It marked the unmistakable beginning of the end of British rule in Nigeria. It also turned out to be the most explosive, the most intriguing, and the most controversial motion ever tabled in the annals of Nigeria's parliament. But what exactly made it so controversial? What made it so explosive? What made it so intriguing? To understand that, we'll have to go back in time to the earlier days of colonial Nigeria. By 1903, British forces had gained full control of the area we now know as Nigeria. But conquering a place is one thing, governing it is a different challenge entirely. How exactly do you govern a landmass over 3 times the size of the entire Britain and has over 15 million people? One option, you hire thousands of British administrators and govern it like a proper district of the empire, similar to maybe what France did in West Africa or what Germany did in East Africa and Central Africa. However, you'll have to hire a lot of administrators and you'll have to offer a significant pay to convince anyone good enough for that job to travel to such a remote place. It would have been like trying to hire someone to work deep in the Amazon. You might find someone, but definitely not for cheap. The British Colonial Office took a more cost effective approach. They turned to the existing leadership structures for governance. After subduing a local population, they'll identify the local leaders and rule through those leaders. If the leader was ready to play ball and follow their instructions, they'll keep them in place. If not, they'll be deposed and replaced by someone more amenable to them. Lord Frederick Lugard, a British colonial officer, called this indirect rule. The argument for indirect rule wasn't just that it was cost effective, it was also easier to maintain peace. Some might say the peace of a graveyard, but that's just me. Anyways, because although traditional leadership lost their full autonomy, they maintained most of their internal power. In fact, their powers were now backed by the full might of British colonial force. Why? Why exactly did the British colonial force back them so much? Because indirect rule relied on those local powers to function. This dynamic meant that it was less likely for revolts to occur. So let's think of it this way. Imagine you were a leader of a town. British forces have taken over your town, but they keep you on as leader and back you against any opposition. In return, you'll have to take instructions from them. But don't forget, if you revolt, you'll most likely be deposed or killed. What exactly would you do in that situation? Let me know. Put a comment in the comment section. In areas where there were no traditional rulers, this was common in the East among the Igbos, the British officers will appoint warrant chiefs who ruled with their backing. As you might imagine, this caused a lot of issues, but that's a story for another day. Today's story is it puts a lot of power in the hands of what the British now called native authorities. And here is where tensions begin to emerge. Even before the arrival of Britain as the preeminent authority in the area, Western education had already begun to spread in what is now Nigeria. Coastal cities like Lagos drew in Western educated Africans and black people from places like Brazil, Sierra Leone, Cuba, places that had and still have a diaspora population and wanted to, return home. The Christian church had also begun its missionary work in Africa. They built schools to teach converts how to read and write so that they can study the Bible, and built institutions of higher learning for students who wanted to go as far up as become clergymen. In fact, the first school in Nigeria was built in 1843 in Badagry by the Christian Missionary Society. The school is still there today. So if you're ever in Badagry, give it a visit. And by the way, Badagry is an excellent place to go if you're interested in early Nigerian history. If you're ever asked, where was the first night, just tell the person to pause and say Badagry. You might be wrong, but it's a good chance you'll be right. Anyways, the first secondary school, or as our American friends will call it, the first high school, was also built by the Christian Mission Society in 1859. So, random knowledge for you to put in your mind. By the early 1900s, a growing class of Western educated Africans began to emerge, and specifically Nigerians, and they resented the idea of being ruled over by local traditional rulers. Why? So, to understand this, we'll have to review the hierarchy that we have created already, or better to say, that the British has created already. The hierarchy is British officials on top, traditional rulers in the middle, the general populace at the bottom. So, by this structure, those Western educated Africans exist in the general populace. They're no different from them. They are just in the bottom like them. But by virtue of their education, they felt entitled to a say. They felt entitled to the governance structure of the colony or the protectorate. The white man was no longer a mystery to them, but they were equal. They had gone to the same schools as they were. They had learned the same things that they had. So, why exactly should these people be ruling over them? Or at least, why should these people have complete dominion over them? They wanted a share in the ruling structure of the country or the colony or the protectorate, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to call it protectorate, but really it doesn't matter. Being at the bottom of the power ladder was an unbearable pill for them to swallow. Another issue was that traditional rulers got their powers from local religion and ancestral gods. But for this new Christian educated class, those gods were a thing of the past. Their rulers just reminded them of how backward they believed this old system was. So In 1922, after years of organization, the Governor General, who was the head of the British administration in Nigeria, Sir Hugh Clifford, drafted Nigeria's first constitution, the 1922 Clifford's Constitution. The constitution created a legislative council with 46 members, and more importantly, for the first time in Nigeria's history, four of those were elected positions, three positions for Lagos and one position for Calabar. Now, if you're going to have elected positions, you will need elections. And with elections, you'll get politics. So on the 20th of September 1923, the first ever elections were held in Nigeria. The same year, the first political party in Nigeria was formed, the Nigerian National Democratic Party, founded by Herbert Macaulay. But crucially, this introduced Western educated Nigerians into political life, and their power would only rise. And on that, I think it's time we take a break. So, see you after the break, where we discuss all the constitutional changes that happened and all the events that led to Enahora's famous motion. Thank you. Welcome back. So, before the break, we ended with the ascent of the Western educated Nigerian to the political scene. Before I go on, I've been saying Western educated Nigerian or Western educated African. I'm deliberately adding the Western classification to distinguish from other Africans who have been educated in their own customs. For example, in the Sokoto Caliphate in northern Nigeria, there was a rich history of Islamic education and scholarship. Would I say a person without education is not educated? No. But that education will be different from a Western style education. I'm adding this disclaimer because I might interchange between educated and Western educated for brevity, but I'll mean Western educated. Okay, so moving on. In 1939, Sir Bernard Bodilon, another Governor General, another Nigerian Governor General, split the Southern Protectorate into two regions, the Eastern and Western region. The country was now split into three regions, the Northern, Eastern, and Western region. Why was this decision made? Bodilon felt that due to the numerous ethnicities in southern Nigeria, it would be more effective to split the region into two, along loose ethnic boundaries. It also divided the regions in such a way that each region had a dominant ethnic group. Hausas and Fulanis, who are closely linked ethnic groups, that's another story for another day. Comment if you'd like to hear that story because I'm willing to write it. Anyways, the Hausas and Fulanis, who were closely linked ethnic groups, were the majority in the north, the Yorubas in the west, and the Igbos in the east. This was a pragmatic move from Bodilon. The western region and the eastern region had different traditional leadership structures. The western region, which was now majority Yoruba, were ruled by monarchs and title chiefs, the Alaafin of Oyo, the Oni of Ife, the Oba of Benin, the Oba of Lagos, and a host of others. This was different in the east, which was now majority Igbo, who structured themselves more as confederated city-states with more of a democratic leadership structure. They had no monarchs. Over in the north, in the Sokoto Caliphate, the Sultan of Sokoto and his emirs ruled over a large expanse of the north. By splitting it into three regions, you could modify your administration to deal with these different types of leaderships. The large expanse controlled by the Caliphate in the north, the democratic confederations of states in the east, and the mix of monarchs and title chiefs in the west. Remember, the British did not rule directly. They ruled through these leaders, through these leadership structures. So it makes sense from their perspective to fine tune their administration along these lines. Now, I have to add, these regions had significant minority populations and they will play a major part as this story progresses. So keep that in mind. Back to the story. Splitting the country into these regions makes it easier to govern, but it inadvertently ties ethnicity not just to regions, but to politics. This, as we will find out in the series, has disastrous consequences. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Meanwhile, the educated class kept growing. It now wasn't mostly the people in the coast who wanted representation, but people in the interiors wanted representation as well. If you remember, in the Clifford Constitution, there were only 4 elected seats in the Legislative Council, and those seats went only to Lagos and Calabar. Calls for a wider and more inclusive constitution started getting louder. So, in 1946, Sir Arthur Richards, another Governor General, proposed a constitutional amendment. Those amendments led to the 1946 Richards Constitution. So, what exactly was different about this one? Well, a lot. The Richards Constitution, for one, instituted regional councils. Members of the regional council were nominated by the native authorities. Remember, we talked about native authorities before. They are essentially traditional rulers who were there before the British, or some were appointed by the British. But it was essentially the local leadership. Each regional council would in turn nominate members to a central legislative council. So the central legislative council would be a body that represents the whole country. Again, you could call it country, you could call it protectorate, you could call it colony. Protectorate is probably the most accurate thing for this time frame, because at the time it was a protectorate. But again, call it whatever you want. The northern region had 9 nominees to that central legislative council. The west had 6, and the east had 5. The governor nominated 4 members, and the 4 elected members from Lagos and Calabar remained. So this was great. Everybody loved it, and it all went swimmingly well. Kumbaya, let's go home. This is wonderful. The country is great. Make the flag. This is God. We love the British. Well, as you might have guessed, that was not the case. The constitution had a number of problems, and it managed to anger everybody. First, if you're an educated Nigerian outside Lagos or Calabar, you were still frozen from political life because the native authorities appointed the members of the regional council, so they effectively controlled it, and the central legislative council was controlled by the British appointees and members nominated by the same regional council. So the central legislative council, the members of the central legislative council were appointed by the British colonial officers or the British colonial leadership, and people nominated by the regional councils, which was controlled by the native authorities. So you were quite certain that unless you had really strong ties with your local rulers, meaning you have been nice to them, you haven't talked bad about them, you haven't insulted them, or you had really good ties with British officials, you were likely not going to get nominated to that council. So you have been frozen out of political life, essentially. Another point of contention was that the regional council had no legislative power. They could not make any laws for their region. They could only make recommendations that would be deliberated by the Central Legislative Council. So again, keep that in mind. Also, during the preparation of the Constitution, there was no consultation with the local leaders or any stakeholders. The Constitution was made primarily in the British Colonial Office. Now, the Constitution wasn't all that bad. It introduced for the first time representation from each region in government, and crucially, for the first time, northern leaders and southern leaders worked together in the Central Legislative Council. So, an aside, let's talk about this. So, the Richards Constitution came in 1946, and from earlier in the episode, Chief Anthony Onahoro made his now famous motion in 1953. So there's a 7-year gap between when the northern leaders or the northern peoples and the southern people started working together as one in a quote unquote national institution, which is the Central Legislative Council. So think about that for a second. The North and the South, which were vastly different, we'll discuss a little about that in this episode, were working together for the first time just 7 years before a call for independence. So I want you to think about, how do you think that will affect people's views of independence? So, think about that. I think that's something good to think about. Given all these problems, in 1949, under another Governor General, Sir John McPherson, another constitutional review was conducted. This time, widespread consultations from stakeholders in each region were requested. McPherson even provided a list of questions and distributed it to the different stakeholders in each region. And all interested bodies were free to submit a memorandum to the government asking for what they wanted in this new constitution or from this new constitutional review. So I have to admit, it was a very open process, and I'll read some of the questions that he sent out to the stakeholders in each region. Do you wish to see a fully centralized system with all legislative and executive power concentrated at the center? Or do we wish to develop a federal system under which each different region of the country will exercise a measure of internal autonomy? Another question. If we favor a federal system, should we retain the existing regions with some modification of existing regional boundaries? Or should we form regions on some new basis, such as the many linguistic groups which exist in Nigeria? Think about those questions. Ponder on them for a second before you continue. Pause. After all the questions had been sent in January 1950, representatives from each region gathered in Ibadan for the All Nigerian Conference to debate the questions posed. Following the debates, the 1951 McPherson Constitution was passed. So, what changed this time? Here are some of the key changes. The regional house were now legislative, no longer advisory. Regional house members would now be elected by popular vote, not nominated by the native authorities, meaning we now have regional elections. So those members in the regional councils will no longer be nominated by the native authorities. Again, native authorities, traditional rulers, that's what I mean there. They will now be elected by the people of those regions or by the peoples of those regions. Regional executive councils will be created, composing of ministers appointed by regional houses, and each council will be led by the lieutenant governor. So there will be a regional executive council, and that will be filled with ministers who will be appointed or nominated by members of the regional council. But the head of those ministers will be the lieutenant governor, who is the deputy of the governor general of the country of Nigeria. The Central Legislative Council, which will now be called the House of Representatives, would have its members nominated by the regional houses. So there will be 68 members from the north, 34 members from the east, and 34 members from the west. The Federal Executive Council would have 18 members, 4 nominated from each region, and 6 appointed by the Governor General. 4 will be appointed from each region, so that's 4 times 3, northwest, east, 12. Then 6 will be appointed by the Governor General, so those will be appointed positions. The Constitution was a major change, and on the surface, it provided everything that Nigerian nationalists had requested. However, the Action Group, the political party which recently won the regional elections in the West, identified several issues with the Constitution. We'll discuss the Action Group and those elections in detail in the next episode when we dive into the different political parties. The 1951 regional elections were controversial, to say the least. But after the Action Group won the 1951 elections, they compiled a list of ministers and sent it over to the lieutenant governor, who, under the Constitution, was the president of the regional executive council, just like the governor general was the president of the federal executive council. The AG members expected this process to be quick and easy, a rubber stamp, essentially, just, whatever, I give you the names, you stamp it, you move on, we go. However, the lieutenant governor, Sir Hugo Marshall, informed them that he will review the list and see whether he will accept or reject the nominees. This infuriated the AG members or the action group members. Let me not start with acronyms. They also found out that under the constitution, the ministers appointed to the region's executive council did not have full control over their ministries. So the ministers that they will appoint to the regional executive council, they had control, but they didn't have full control. The person who had the final say was the top civil servant of that ministry, who was the British appointee. So the person who really had control, who had full control, was the British appointee, or basically the British Colonial Office had that full control over it. So example, let's say, they want to make a decision on education. Example, free education in the whole of the West, which happened. Not, it was a primary school education, but whatever, let's stick to the story. Free education all over the West, somebody come up with the idea. This is purely hypothetical. If the head of the ministry, who is not a minister, who is some civil servant who becomes the lead of that ministry, says, no, we're not going to implement that, that's the end of that story. It's not going to get implemented. He had the ultimate say in what happens. So the AG members did not accept that situation. The situation was unacceptable to the action group. And on the 10th of June 1952, top officials of the action group, including their leader, Chief Obafemi Awolowo, met with the Governor General to discuss some of the issues with the Constitution. And I think it's safe to say that the governor did not appreciate the complaints from the action group. He argued that the Constitution had gone through several phases of consultations and that the action group had failed to give it a chance before discrediting it. Now, I just said that this meeting happened on the 10th of June 1952. Now, remember, or not remember, I never said it, but I'm saying it now, that the Constitution was passed on the 1st of January 1952. It was passed before that, but the implementation of that Constitution was to start on the 1st of January 1952. So this was just, 5-6 months after the Constitution was to be in use. So you can understand why McPherson says, hey, look, guys, give it a second, try it out, see how you like it before you start complaining to me, before you start barging into my office and asking me that you want things changed. Anyways, let's get back to the story. So he argued that, hey, guys, give it some time. It's going to work. It's going to be fine. Just chill out. Awolowo countered, saying that, look, my party had gone to the polls promising voters certain things. And if their policies and appointees could be blocked easily by the ministry's head of department and lieutenant governor, then it would be a matter of political embarrassment for them. He urged the governor to either consider reviewing the constitution or telling his lieutenant governor and head of departments to just rubber stamp their proposals. But in that meeting, the governor refused, citing that neither the eastern region nor the northern region had come to him with any complaints about the constitution. So these complaints were coming only from the western region. They were like, hey, look, the north are using this constitution. The east are using this constitution. They don't have a problem with it. Why do you have a problem with it? Chill out. Let's wait. When they have a problem with it, we're all going to come together. We're all going to compile all the problems that you guys have. Then we'll take a good look at the problem. Again, if you're being reasonable, you say that that's not really a bad idea. Awolowo gave a good counter to it. If you have time, read his book. I don't want to kind of go deep into that, but he gave a good counter to it. Well, let me just go. I'm already here. What am I going to do? So he gave an example of a man who buys a car, or 3 people in this case who buys a car. So one person drives it a lot. He drives it every day, goes to work, comes back from work, drives it to see his mistress, whatever. I don't know. He just drives the car, whips the car to exhaustion. Then another person, takes the car for joyrides, and the third person just parks the car in his garage. And he said, well, obviously, the person who drives his car every day, who whips his car to exhaustion, is the one who is going to find the fault in the car first. So you don't need to wait for the other two guys to get to you before you say, okay, this car has a problem. Trust the person who is really trying to use this car. That person is, you know, a reliable source. So if you're in product management, I'm sure you agree with this. So again, it was a good counter from Awolowo, and I want to leave it to your imagination who you think the other two, like who you think the other two guys are when you consider when you map it to regions. I don't know. Yeah, I don't. Who do you think that is? Put it in the comment section. Anyways, that was the action group's counter. But McPherson told the action group members to go home, test the constitution, just wait it out, try it out, see if it works. Then, you know, we can have this discussion again. But with no side willing to give an inch, the action group made their move. They decided that they would raise a motion for self-government, which would effectively give them full control of their region. It will give them full control of their regional house, and it will give them full control of the regional executive council. So, how would the other regions respond to this? How would the British respond to this? And will it work? Stay tuned and find out after the break. Thank you. Welcome back. Welcome back. Hope you had a wonderful break. So, before the break, we discussed the events that led to the constitutional crisis. The crisis that led the action group to go all in 1953 and raise a motion for self-government by 1956. The action group had made up their mind. I read a quote from Chief Obafemi Awolowo, the leader of the action group on the issue. After the minor crisis of 10th of June 1952, the attitude of the lieutenant governor and his officials changed for the better. I was inclined to believe that this was due partly to the realization on their part that we were determined to have our way. We were, however, not satisfied, and because of this, we made up our minds to wreck the McPherson Constitution as soon as favorable opportunity offered itself. Now, the motion has been raised, but the question now was, would it be debated? Would it be voted on? I think if you were to ask British officials in the know about the motion, they'll tell you, we don't think this motion will be debated on today. And that could have easily been the case because on that day, the 31st of March 1953, when the order paper was released, the order paper, by the way, is a document that lists the agenda to be discussed in the order they will be discussed. So, back to the story. When the order paper was released, the motion for self-government was placed last of the 7 motions to be debated. So, I'll let you think of that, what you may. Another issue was that the House was set to go for a long break the next day. So the House was set to be adjourned indefinitely, and only a vote from the Regional Council will bring the House back up. So no one really knew when the House was going to meet again. So that was a problem. So the cards were stacked massively against the action group. However, 4 of the 7 motions raised that day were by the AG, and the other 3 were by the NCNC. We'll talk more about the parties in the next episode. I'm calling a lot of parties, but I promise I'll explain them or explain what they mean and what they represent and how they were formed, so on and so forth. The NCNC, the party that ran the Eastern region, had a faction that supported the motion. They also had another faction that didn't support that motion. They were on the side of the Governor General, that is McPherson. And they didn't want that motion to be debated. They didn't want that motion to be voted on. But the NCNC faction in support of the motion, led by Dr. Zumba Mbadiwe, promised the action group leaders that they would not move any of their motions. The action group also agreed not to move any of their other motions, meaning the only motion left to be debated was that of self-government by 1956. In response to this, a northern representative, one who will feature throughout this series, throughout up till the end, Alhaji Tafawa Balewa, moved amendments to Enahara's motion. Instead of self-government by 1956, it will be self-government as soon as practicable. After this, another northern representative, Alhaji Ibrahim Imam, moved that the debate be adjourned. Since the northern representatives had a majority in the House, it was clear that the debates and the vote was not going to happen on that day. The action group protested vehemently, and Awolowo gave this closing argument. I picked this speech because I really liked it. I don't know why I liked it. It was just, I found it interesting. It was a good speech. We should be free to say our mind on this issue without being fettered. And the North should be free to say its mind without being fettered. At the vision time, we know by the look of things that we will be beaten, but we are not afraid. It will go on record that A, B, C, and D once voted for freedom for their country, and that E, F, G, and H once voted against. This is all we are seeking. But what do we find now? We find that the northern majority is not only being used to having their way, but it is also being used in preventing the minority from having their say. So that was the speech. Again, be the judge. Comment if you like it or not. Please do. I want to see a lot of comments. Anyways, so the tactics of the action group was clear. They wanted to force a vote in the House and get the northern leaders on record voting against independence. They were aware that the northern leaders did not support independence yet. It's not that they didn't support independence at all. They wanted to be free, of course, but they didn't support it yet. And without their support, they were unlikely to win a vote. But getting their leaders to vote explicitly against independence will be a stick that they can use to beat them with the next election. Just keep campaigning. These people don't want you to be free. These people want the white man to rule over you. These people want the British to rule over you. They are not serious. They are puppets. They are kutums. They are blah, blah, blah. So you can see how that will work against them. Northern leaders, though, they didn't take the bait. They moved to adjourn the debate and avoid the vote entirely. In response, the action group and supporting NCNC members walked out of the House in protest to the adjournment. After the Southern representatives had worked out, the Northern leaders left the House and were booed and jeered and heckled by the Lagos crowd. You can imagine them walking out, all sorts of insults being rained on them, people stoning them, threatening to attack them. To the crowd, these leaders were sellouts, the people holding them back, the people keeping the yoke of British rule in their lives. The British, who they had come to believe were the cause of all their sufferings. This massively annoyed the northern leaders. But I think the important question to ask here is, why would the northern leadership not want independence now? Why wouldn't they want their freedom now? What exactly about 1956 bothered them so much? To answer this question, we'll have to reference an earlier point in this episode. So all those things I was talking about in the beginning, they actually have meaning. I wasn't just trying to tell you that to show off. There was a point to the story. So we're getting there. Remember when we talked about indirect rule and how the British would use local institutions to run the government? Well, the largest local institution in northern Nigeria was the Sokoto Caliphate. The Sultan of Sokoto, together with his emirs, were in charge of administering large portions of the north. Why does this matter? And what makes it different from the other regions? The first one is its political structure is tied with its religion, Islam. This one isn't crucial, it's not odd or even unique to Nigeria as a whole that the political system is intrinsically tied to a religion. What does make it significant is the large area under their control. Because they had a large, centralized, and hierarchical form of government, it made them more suitable for indirect rule. They already had a strong, ready made governance structure that covered a large area, meaning if you were a British colonial officer, you knew exactly who to speak to and for what. And you also needed less staff for your administration. Again, we talked about this earlier. So, Keats now. Keats. That's why we said it before. Keats. If you have not listened to it, please rewind. Thank you. So the colonial officers were strongly incentivized to uphold and protect their system. This system that was top down, very hierarchical, very structured. Now, we mentioned earlier that the spread of Western education in Nigeria was done primarily through Christian missionary schools. These schools were able to spread in the South, mostly at the edges of society at first, but Christianity and Western education gradually spread across the entire South. Sir William McGregor, governor of the Lagos colony from 1899 to 1904, expressed his displeasure with, and I quote, mission educated young men who live in the villages interfering with the native councils and acting as correspondents for the mendacious native press. There was also displeasure about the education provided by the Christian mission among the British officers. British officials felt that the education provided by the Christian mission made it difficult to run the government. Lord Frederick Lugard, former High Commissioner of Northern Nigeria and Governor General of Nigeria, remarked on this issue in his book, The Dual Mandate. I'm quoting from his book. The lack of discipline among mission converts has indeed occasionally led to political disturbances. But in Nigeria and in Ashanti, the fault has, and I think, lain primarily on the governments. For the grant on which the aided schools depend has been based on a purely intellectual test. Great as are the results achieved by the missions in Africa, and they are great indeed, they too must get their share of the blame in having set too slight a value on discipline and concentrated too much on the acquisition of such knowledge as will enable their pupils to credibly do well in the government's examinations. End of quote. So by the time the North had been brought under the control of the British had grown wary of Christian mission education, and after some complaints by Northern rulers to the British colonial officers, British officials banned Christian proselytizing in northern Nigeria. The goal was to ensure that the local political system, which they so readily relied on, remained stable. In their view, they were learning from the mistakes made in southern Nigeria. Education was to be funded by the government, no longer through the Christian missionary schools. They were going to fund it themselves. They were going to make sure that the information that got to people was from them and the training that got to people was from them. So, again, make what you want with that information. I'm sure you would, anyways. However, that funding that were expected from the British government, it never came. Now, if you're being generous, you'll say involvement in World War I, which happened in 1914 to 1918, limited Britain's ability to invest funds in colonial education. If you are being cynical, you'll say they felt education hindered their ability to rule, and it was a deliberate attempt to control the people of the North. Now, it could as well be both. It could be neither, but make your decision. Again, comment. I want to discuss with you about the situation. I find this situation very interesting. I find the story very interesting. And I want to hear all the diverse views that people have on this story. So let's continue. Either way, the effect was the same. By 1953, when the call for independence was made, the educational gap between the North and the South was substantial. According to a study in 1951, only 2% or 2.5% of Nigerian primary school enrollment was from northern Nigeria. Even in 1960, less than 10% of primary school enrollment was from northern Nigeria. So these are dire numbers. And as dire as these numbers may sound, like, oh my God, this is horrible, 2.5%, 5%, oh my God, that's bad. They're even worse when you consider that the northern region held over half, not half, over half of the population of Nigeria. It wasn't nearly enough, and northern leaders were very well aware of this gap. They were also aware of the disadvantage it put them in. They had fewer clerks for administration, they had fewer trained lawyers, they had only been introduced to parliamentary politics in 1946 with the passing of the Riots Constitution, as I've discussed before. Unlike the South, who, although in a limited capacity, they had been involved one way or the other since 1922. They had political parties, the NYM, National Youth Movement or the Nigerians Youth Movement, or LYM, the Lagos Youth Movement, the NNDP, the Nigerian National Democratic Party. So they have dabbled in politics way before the North. The North, well, we'll talk about it in the next episode. Let's not talk too much about it now. So the North, they wanted time to bridge the gap with the South before pushing for independence. They feared that if the educational and political gap remained, the South will completely dominate them and they will erode their culture, erode their way of life, and just, to be the year of the Southerner, completely dominate them. And that was something they were afraid of or bothered by. The northern leader Ahmadu Bello once remarked on a visit to Lagos in 1949 that the whole place was alien to our ideas, and we found the members of other regions might as well belong to another world, as far as I'm concerned. There had also been little mixing between northerners and southerners. Northern leaders who visited the South were closely guarded by British officials to prevent them from being contaminated by Southern politics. Southern people who moved to the North were placed in segregated areas, towns that they called Sabongari, new towns. That was a pretty firehouse accent. Whatever. The press from Southern Nigeria didn't help either. They consistently tagged the conservative leaders of the North as backward, unintelligent, British puppets, Uncle Toms, those kind of derogatory terms. In the newspapers in the South, there were constant slander of the Northern leadership. All this led to massive distrust and now fear of the South. They believed the goal of the South was to remove the British and take over the entire country. And more importantly, their goal was to rule over them. That is, the goal of the South was to rule over the North. That's what the North thought. Now we understand why the North was opposed to independence by 1956. But what happens next? After the incident in Lagos, the Northern leaders reconvened and planned their next action. After the meeting in Lugard Hall, Kaduna, a city in northern Nigeria, they came out with an 8-point program. For the sake of time, I'm not going to list all the 8 points. I'm going to try to summarize what they said in those 8 points. So the 8-point programs can be summarized as: Nigeria should be a union of autonomous states with equal representation at the center. Each state should have the right to succeed and maintain its own civil institutions. Common services like currency, foreign affairs, and central infrastructure will be shared. while internal movement remains free and fiscal arrangements will follow a principle of derivation. So the last part is just saying whatever money comes into the country centrally would be shared to each region based on whatever derivation formula that the regions come to agree upon. So the northern leaders, they have drawn their own line in the sand and they have said, look, we want out, or at least we want a path out. We don't want to be bonded with you guys so strongly. We want to keep our distance from you. It seems like, again, going back to what I've said, the North is looking at it like, oh, these guys want to come and take over us. This is a first move. They want to make a first sharp move because they have the opportunity. So we don't want to be closely aligned to you anymore. We want to give you our distance. We don't want the law to give you the power to take over our communities and take over our space. Now, again, I'm putting my mind into the head of a Northerner. In response, the action group launched a campaign into Kano. So their goal was to try to appeal to the northern people directly and bypass the northern leadership. Again, the northern people are the people who vote. Maybe if we can bypass the leadership, we can get people to vote for us in the next elections, then we can make a move by ourselves. I don't know what their strategy was, but I'm guessing that was their strategy. During the tour of Kano that the AG made, which was led by Chief Samuel Akintola, another key player in this story. Trust me, we're going to be talking about him for a long time. It's going to be the focal point of at least 2 episodes. During the tour, Nigerian youths led by the Northern People's Congress organized a protest against the delegation. The protests, which were initially peaceful, began to turn rowdy outside the hotel where the AG delegates scheduled a meeting. The hotel, by the way, was the Colonial Hotel, and it's still there today. It's been renovated and it's now called the Central Hotel. So whenever you're in Kano, give it a visit. So again, by the by, I keep making these detours. A massive crowd gathered outside the hotel, and remember, many of the protesters had heard reports of how their representatives were treated in Lagos, and they were itching for revenge. According to the Daily Times reports from that day, protesters started throwing stones at the delegates, and in the ensuing chaos, 3 people were left dead. Now, we've already seen how the Northerners, or why the Northerners, distrusted Southerners. But this distrust had gradually turned into suspicion towards Southern migrants. So it was no longer in the leadership anymore. It was now among the quote unquote rank and file. It was among the common man, so to speak. This distrust had gradually turned into suspicion towards southern migrants who lived in the north. These migrants were typically educated southerners who had moved to the north in search of economic opportunities in the civil service or in the trade. The majority of these southern migrants were from the east, and most of them were Igbo. Many of them occupied good positions in the civil service and were a dominant force in the city's trade. And as I've discussed before, southern migrants lived in segregated areas, Sabongari, me and my awesome accent, away from the heart of the city as part of the policy of not letting southerners and northerners live together. Again, we've all discussed this thing before. All the things I'm saying, I'm not saying them because I just want to spit out facts. It's part of the story. This separation and their economic success only made the suspicion stronger. And it was no surprise that on the next day, the day after those stonings left 3 people dead, the protesters, who were at this point were now rioters, went straight to those segregated areas, straight to Kano Sabongari, and they started to barge in. So the first day, the police held them off, but after a while, they finally broke through the gates of that town and they set it ablaze. It took a state of emergency and the army to suppress the resulting violence, and even then, there were still pockets of unrest in the entire city. with rioters taking the opportunity to loot stores owned by Southerners. It took a passionate plea by the Emir of Kano to finally end the violence. So, what began as a protest over politics turned into a bloody riot that left over 40 people dead, many of them Southerners, many of them Igbo. This was just a small taste of things to come in the future republic, and we'll discuss them as this story unfolds. But after all this violence, what's going to happen to the Constitution? Would it not succeed? Where do we go from here? All this and more after the break. Welcome back. Before the break, we talked about the constitutional crisis that led to the call for self-government in the House of Representatives, how the Northern leaders responded, the reaction from the Lagos crowd, why the Northerners did not want independence by 1956, and a series of events that led to the Kano riots of 1953. So, where do we go from here? In response to the political drama unfolding, it was clear that there needed to be a change and there needed to be some dialogue. So, on the 21st of May 1953, just a couple of days after the Kano riots, Sir Oliver Lyttelton, the British Secretary of State to the colonies, made this speech to the British Parliament. Recent events have shown that it is not possible for the three regions of Nigeria to work together effectively in a federation so closely knit as that provided by the present constitution. Her Majesty's government in the United Kingdom, while greatly regretting this, consider that the constitution will have to be redrawn to provide for greater regional autonomy and for the removal of powers of intervention by the center which can, without detriment to other regions, be placed entirely within regional competence. And so the stage was set for another round of constitutional conferences. Leaders from the major parties in Nigeria, parties that I promise we will discuss in the next episode, were invited to London for constitutional talks. They later reconvened in Lagos in 1954 to finalize the discussions. These talks were not smooth. Remember, Northern leadership had come into the meeting with an announced 8-point program, one which had on its agenda a nod and a wink to secession. Well, not really a nod and a wink, it was a full-blown and direct talk about the secession. So not nod and wink, it's pretty straightforward. Anyways, the three regions agreed on one thing, that more power needed to be transferred to the regions, but they disagreed on the role of the federal government. The North had announced their 8-point program, which wanted a severely diminished central government. The lead representative from the North, the Saraduna of Sokoto, Ahmadu Bello, requested that Lagos be removed from the West and set as the federal capital territory. That is just the capital. And those were the only grounds on which he would accept a federal legislative body, basically a federal lawmaking body that can make laws for the entire Nigeria. He argued, and I think fairly, that the area housing the federal parliament should be neutral. And since Lagos also housed the largest and busiest ports in Nigeria, which served the whole nation, it would be unjust to have it part of the Western region, which it was at the time. Action Group members who controlled the Western region, in response, made their own declaration. They wanted secession too. At this point, some of you might be thinking, why not just secede? As I've discussed before the break, there's already been ethnic tension that led to violence and death in Kano. Is this really going to get any better? Why not just take the opportunity now and let everybody be on their way? I think that would be a fair question. But to understand why they didn't just succeed, you need to understand the motivations of the people in that room. We'll start with the North, as their case is, I think, is more straightforward. They were the ones who were more open to the idea of secession at the time. Well, I've discussed all the reasons earlier in the episode, the educational gap, the cultural domination, all so on and so forth. But moving to the South, you have two major parties. The Action Group, who we've mentioned already, we have discussed a Wall of War, inaugural, so on, and the NCNC, which is the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons. The NCNC, led by Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, a man who, again, we'll discuss in the next episode, was a Pan-Africanist. Now, the goal of Pan-Africanism was to unite the whole of Africa under one political umbrella. He, and to an extent his party, had the ultimate goal of creating a United States of Africa. Now, how do you try to convince other African states to join this United States if you can't even unite Nigeria? The simple answer is you can't, and you don't. So, in a report by British officials who claim to have intercepted a letter from Kwame Nkrumah, who later became the first president of Ghana, to Nnamdi Azikiwe, he urged Azikiwe to be, and I quote, prepared to make great sacrifices in order to ensure that all delegates of Nigeria spoke with one voice. The report continued that the CPP of the Gold Coast was not only concerned with self-government for the whole of West Africa, it was also concerned with the self-government of the whole of Africa after each territory had gained its own self-rule. If a split took place in Nigeria, then this idea will come to nothing. So the NCNC did not want secession because of their broader goals in terms of Africa. Moving to the Action Group, its leader, Chief Obafemi Awolowo, was not necessarily a Pan-Africanist, but he was not fundamentally opposed to the idea, but it wasn't a priority to him. However, to some of his party members, Pan-Africanism was desirable, and there was also the practical situation that Nigeria as a whole was a far better political, economic prospect than Nigeria split up. Now, some of you might argue about that political statement, even the economical, but again, feel free to comment and share your views in the comment section. This made the issue of secession a sticky one for the Action Group, but for the British, the idea for secession was a non-starter. The British had made these multi-ethnic colonies all over Africa. If one, especially one the size and importance of Nigeria, goes the way of secession, the British government will be negotiating tens of secessions all over the continent. Their business and political interests in the region would have to be reconfigured across the entire continent, erasing any advantage that they had had in the continent from being the colonial masters for all these years. Again, you could have different sentiments towards that statement. Put it in the comment section, please. So in the end, they came to a compromise. The compromise that led to the 1954 Liechtenstein Constitution. The compromise, or some of the key points of the compromise, were Lagos was now to be the Federal Capital Territory. A Federal House was to be kept with clearly defined powers. So the Federal House will have powers with regards to defense, foreign affairs, and monetary policy. All powers not clearly assigned to the Federal House were now the business of the Regional House. The regions would now have a premier who would act as the regional head of the government. So before we discussed that the head of the Council of Ministers will be the Lieutenant Governor. That will no longer be the case. It will now be the premier who will be voted into power by the Regional House. Elections were to be held for both the Regional House and the Federal House, so no longer appointments by the Regional House to the Federal House, which, it might seem like a small issue, but it was a small problem that was beginning to come up because you could get elected into the Regional House, then get nominated to the federal house. So you were both in the regional house and the federal house. So it was again, we could do a topic on this issue. There was a small crisis here, but we're not going to dwell into it. We're going to move on. The regions will be granted full self-government if requested for by 1956. That means the appointed ministers will not have full control over their departments. Again, if we go back to the episode and we look at the discussion that Obafemi Awolowo had with John McPherson regarding control of the departments, we can see why that is a major change. So the constitutional arrangement was a huge development and a mighty step forward towards full independence. At this point, it was clear to everyone involved that it was just a matter of time before the country gained full independence. There was still one more key issue, though: the issue of minority rights. We discussed earlier that by splitting Nigeria into three regions, you now have one supermajority ethnic group in each region: the Hausa Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the west, and the Igbos in the east. This creates a significant issue for the minority population in those regions. If the regional houses are autonomous and likely to be dominated by the majority ethnic group in that region, what happens to them? And by them, I mean, what happens to the minorities? With the British at the helm, they could always air their grievances to the British officials. But with independence, at least with regional independence, the British will be out of the political scene and they will be left at the mercy of that majority ethnic group. And some of these minority ethnic groups were quite large and had a very rich history on their own. For example, if you've watched the movie Black Panther, there's a scene in the movie where Killmonger goes to a museum and he sees all these artifacts from Africa. One of them was from the Edo people of Benin. The Edo people had been part of an independent kingdom of Benin as recently as 1897 and were now a minority group in the western region. So here's this massive former kingdom that has been there for at least 1,000 years, now going to be a minority ethnicity or minority ethnic group in the western region. So this was unpalatable to them. The Jaws, another example, they were a large tribe with a long history of maritime trade, and they were now split between the eastern region and the western region, and they were not just a minority in both. Over in the north, the Middle Belt region, which was majority Christian and had a long history of resisting Hausa Fulani incursion into their land, were not pleased with the idea of being tied in to the Hausa Fulanis in the north, and especially being tied in as a minority partner. Given all this, petition after petition were sent over to the British government by the minority leaders, and in 1957, Sir Henry Willink was tapped to create a commission of inquiry to, and I quote, ascertain the facts about the fears of minorities in any part of Nigeria and to propose means of allaying those fears, whether well or ill founded. So that's a quote from the famous Willink Commission of Inquiry. After 6 months in Nigeria, Sir Willink released his report in July 1958. He agreed that minority fears were valid, but did not go as far as recommending new regions. He recommended certain rights to be added to the Constitution to alleviate minority fears of suppression, and he also recommended there be increased investment in the Niger Delta regions by the regional and federal governments. He identified that area as an area that was highly underinvested in and was highly marginalized by the Nigerian government. By the by, but let's think about that. Despite this, the push for new states by the minority groups was still alive and well and had a listening ear in both the Action Group and the NCNC. In the 1958 conference leading to independence, the Action Group called for the creation of three new states: the Midwestern states from the Western region, the core states from the Eastern region, so core standing for Calabar, Ogoja, and Rivers, and the Middle Belt states from the Northern region. The British made it explicit. If Nigeria created new states now, independence would be delayed. The British made it clear that they would not be handing over the reins of power right after a major change to the political system. The Action Group were now in a tight spot. Members of the party wanted the new states, but pressing for those states could lead to delay of the independence process. It would be a huge stain to their name and a massive political risk if they were tagged as the party that held up independence. Because of this, they succumbed and pushed the fight for the creation of new states to the future. Now, just my 2 cents here is I feel a lot of issues that happened during the Republic was due to situations like this. There were certain things that needed to be resolved, and I feel the political leadership in the country never tried to resolve those issues. They always wanted to push things forward, and their major goal was independence, in the sense that if independence comes, then we can settle all these issues in the future. But the problem was that it was probably better if they had settled those issues before they had gone to independence, because with the British as an arbitrator there, it might have been helpful. But with no arbitrator, violence ended up being the way to resolve some of these conflicts. Again, we were getting ahead of ourselves. There will be enough violence in this series. With the issue of state creation out of the way, the date for independence was set, and it was the 1st of October, 1960. But before the festivities and the national fanfare of Independence Day, and the green, white, green of the Nigerian flag is hoisted high, we have the very serious affair of the 1959 elections. Who were the major parties? Who were the key figures? Who won? Who will lead the newly independent Nigeria? Who will be prime minister? We'll find out in the next episode. Thank you for joining me on the first episode of Afrocentric History. I've covered a lot of ground today, from indirect rule and the rise of Western education to constitutional conferences and the bloody riots that nearly tore the country apart before independence even arrived. In the next episode, we'll dive deep into the political parties that shaped Nigeria's future: the Action Group, the NCNC, the Northern People's Congress. We'll meet the larger-than-life figures who led them: Awolowo, Azikiwe, and Ahmadu Bello. And we'll see how the 1959 elections set the stage for everything that followed. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe, leave a review in the comments, and share it with anyone interested in African history, or in history in general. Until next time, this is Caro. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful week. Have a great one.